The sky over northern Germany looked calm from a distance, but at altitude it was a hostile place, cold and thin, where mistakes were punished instantly. High above the clouds, a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt cut through the air, its massive frame built to absorb punishment rather than finesse. Inside the cockpit sat Second Lieutenant Robert L. Booth, 19 years old, flying not with confidence, but with focus sharpened by survival. The aircraft vibrated around him, every gauge alive, every sound a warning. The Thunderbolt was famous for bringing pilots home with holes in its skin and damage in its wings, yet even its reputation for toughness could not protect those who pushed it into unknown, aerodynamic territory. Booth flew with the 56 Fighter Group, a unit that trusted power and altitude over elegance. The P-47 was fast in a dive, brutally so, and that strength concealed a danger few pilots fully understood. When a German Focke-Wulf 190 appeared ahead and broke downward into a steep dive, Booth followed immediately. The Thunderbolt accelerated with terrifying efficiency, the engine roaring as gravity added to its momentum. The horizon vanished, replaced by rushing air and the rising pitch of speed. The faster the aircraft went, the more unnatural it felt, as if the air itself had thickened and hardened around the wings. When Booth pulled back on the control stick, nothing happened. He applied more force, then more still, but the aircraft did not respond. The rudder pedals felt dead beneath his boots. The Thunderbolt had entered compressibility, a state where shock waves formed across the wings and control surfaces, disrupting airflow and stripping the pilot of authority. It was not a stall, not a mechanical failure, but something far worse, a condition in which the aircraft simply stopped listening. Pilots who entered it often never recovered, not because they lacked skill, but because the physics of flight had turned against them. The altimeter unwound rapidly as the ground rushed closer. Booth reduced throttle, tried again to pull out, but the aircraft remained locked in its dive. The sound of the wind screaming across the airframe became almost physical, a pressure that pressed into his chest and skull. The Thunderbolt vibrated under loads it was never meant to carry, and Booth knew with sudden clarity that training had nothing left to offer him. There was no procedure, no checklist, no maneuver taught in flight school that addressed this moment. He was fully conscious, fully aware, and utterly powerless. Fear collapsed time into seconds. Booth's eyes flicked between instruments and the approaching ground. This was how pilots died, not in fire or confusion, but trapped in a machine that had become an unstoppable projectile. Acting without calculation, driven by panic rather than reason. Booth reached beside his seat and pulled the landing gear handle. It was the wrong lever, the kind of mistake instructors warned could be fatal. Instead, it saved his life. The landing gear tore into the rushing airflow, generating massive drag. The effect was immediate and violent. The aircraft shuddered as speed bled away, the nose pitching upward as compressibility loosened its grip. The screaming wind softened, the pressure eased, and the control stick came alive in Booth's hands. With immense effort, he pulled the Thunderbolt out of the dive, leveling off just above the ground. The earth streaked past beneath him, close enough to touch but no longer inevitable. For several moments, Booth did nothing but breathe. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat soaked his flight suit despite the freezing air, and the sky felt impossibly quiet after the chaos of the dive. He had survived by accident, not skill, by a mistake that should never have worked. What Booth did not yet understand was that he had stumbled onto something critical. By deploying the landing gear, he had introduced drag powerful enough to disrupt the shock waves that had stolen his control. It was not strength or precision that saved him, but recognition born of panic. As Booth turned his damaged Thunderbolt for home, he believed he had escaped death by chance, unaware that his mistake had just exposed a solution that would change how pilots confronted high-speed flight and save countless lives beyond his own. Booth landed with his nerves still raw, the Thunderbolt shuddering as its wheels met the runway. Ground crews rushed toward the aircraft, expecting visible damage from what should have been a fatal dive. They found stressed seals, warped panels, and a machine that looked abused but intact. The Thunderbolt had survived. Booth climbed out slowly, legs unsteady, replaying the dive in his mind, aware that something extraordinary had happened, but uncertain how to explain it. Without sounding reckless or foolish, in the briefing room the story drew immediate skepticism. Pilots had heard desperate survival tales before, usually followed by funerals. Compressibility was feared because it was unpredictable, and fear bred superstition as much as science. Booth explained the sequence carefully, admitting the truth without embellishment. He had lost control, panicked, and pulled the wrong handle. The landing gear had deployed into the dive, and somehow, impossibly, the aircraft had slowed enough for him to recover. The room remained quiet, not with awe but with doubt. Colonel Hub Zemke listened closely. Zemke was not impressed by luck, but he respected patterns, especially those that ended with pilots walking away. He questioned Booth relentlessly, probing for inconsistencies, demanding specifics about airspeed, altitude, control response, and aircraft behavior. Booth answered as best he could, aware that his credibility depended on clarity rather than confidence. He did not claim discovery. He only described what had happened and what he had felt in the aircraft when control returned. Zemke understood the implications immediately, but he also understood the risk. Dropping landing gear at extreme speed was not a maneuver, it was structural abuse. If Booth was wrong, or if the aircraft reacted differently under slightly altered conditions, the result would not be recovery but catastrophic failure. failure. Still, Zemke had already lost pilots to compressibility dives. Doing nothing was also a decision, and it had proven deadly. The test flight was authorized quietly. No announcements were made, no spectators invited. Booth was chosen not because he was brave, but because he had already survived the mistake. At altitude, with the sky clear and the engine steady, Booth pointed the Thunderbolt into a controlled dive. The airspeed climbed rapidly. The familiar stiffness returned to the controls, that same unnatural resistance that signaled the edge of disaster. This time there was no panic. Booth pulled the landing gear deliberately. The aircraft responded exactly as it had before. Drag exploded across the airframe. Speed fell and control authority returned. Booth retracted the gear and pulled out smoothly. The Thunderbolt obedient once more. There was no miracle this time, only confirmation. The impossible had become repeatable. The reaction among the pilots was immediate and deeply unsettling. Veterans with dozens of kills found themselves listening to a teenager explain how to survive a condition they had learned to fear. Booth stood in front of chalkboards covered in aerodynamic sketches, describing drag vectors and airflow disruption with a humility that made the lesson harder to dismiss. The key, he explained, was timing. Wait too long, and the hydraulic system might not overcome the pressure. Act early, and the aircraft could be saved. Questions came fast. What if the gear failed to retract? What if the aircraft was damaged? What if the maneuver was abused? Booth answered honestly. You fly home slow, he said. You fly home exposed, but you fly home alive. Zemke made the decision official. The maneuver would be taught, but only for emergency use. It was not a trick, not a shortcut, not a weapon. It was a last resort, a way out of a physics trap that had already claimed too many pilots. The knowledge spread the way combat knowledge always did, quietly and urgently. Pilots talked in mess halls, on leave in London bars, and in borrowed minutes between missions. Stories circulated of Thunderbolts surviving dives that should have killed them. Within months, the crash rate from compressibility dives dropped sharply. The maneuver was not yet written into manuals or approved by distant offices, but it lived where doctrine always begins, in the shared memory of those who had survived. Unbeknownst to Booth and Zemke, the balance of the air war had shifted. What began as a panicked mistake was becoming a standard response, and soon it would no longer be a secret. Across the channel, German pilots who believed the Thunderbolt would always die in the dive were about to learn that the rules they relied on no longer applied. The change revealed itself first in combat, not in classrooms or manuals. In the skies over occupied Europe, German pilots had long relied on a simple, reliable truth: the P-47 Thunderbolt could not safely follow a high-speed vertical dive. The aircraft was too heavy, too rigid, and too vulnerable to compressibility. When threatened, Luftwaffe pilots rolled inverted and dove hard, trusting speed and gravity to finish what guns could not. It had worked for years, and doctrine, like habit, is slow to question success. Oberleutnant Karl Heinz was one of those who trusted it completely. A veteran of the Western Front with dozens of victories, he knew Allied aircraft the way a hunter knows terrain. The Thunderbolt was fast and tough, yes, but it could not turn tightly, and it could not survive the dive. That weakness was as dependable as mathematics. When he spotted a P-47 sliding onto his 6 at altitude, Heinz did not panic. He rolled his Focke-Wulf 190 inverted and pulled into a vertical power dive, the maneuver precise, practiced, almost routine. The airspeed climbed rapidly, 700 kilometers per hour, 800. The aircraft remained smooth, responsive, perfectly under control. Heinz glanced back and smiled. The silver American fighter was still there, growing larger in his mirror, his pilot clearly committed. It was a familiar sight, one he had seen many times before. The American was going too fast. Any second now the controls would lock and gravity would finish the job. At low altitude, Heinz hauled back on the stick. The Focke-Wulf responded instantly, wings biting cleanly as it arced out of the dive and leveled just above the treetops. He looked back, already expecting to see smoke or wreckage where the Thunderbolt had driven itself into the countryside, sir. What he saw instead made no sense at all. The P-47 was still there. It looked wrong. Its landing gear hung beneath it like the talons of a massive bird, catching the air, bleeding speed in full view of physics that should have made such a maneuver impossible. The American aircraft had not slammed into the ground. It had slowed in midair, its nose pitching up violently, refusing to die. Then, smoothly, deliberately, the gear retracted. The Thunderbolt surged forward again, engine roaring, no longer trapped in the dive but perfectly positioned behind the German fighter. In that instant, the hunter became the prey. Heinz had no time to react, no time to question what he had just witnessed. 850 caliber machine guns opened fire, their combined recoil invisible but devastating. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through the Focke-Wulf's fuselage, shredding structure, igniting fuel, and erasing the aircraft in a cloud of aluminum and flame. The engagement was over almost as soon as it had reversed. High above the wreckage, the American pilot, Captain Robert Johnson, wiped sweat from his eyes and steadied his breathing. His heart was still racing, not from fear now, but from realization. He keyed his microphone and spoke into the radio, his voice tight with disbelief and triumph. "It works, Booth, it really works." Word spread fast after that. Pilots talked and pilots remembered. The dive, once a death sentence for the Thunderbolt, was no longer an escape route. German tactics that had relied on inevitability now led directly into gunfire. The gear extension maneuver was no longer just a way out of trouble. It had become a way to stay in the fight. Compressibility had lost its power to decide who lived and who died. The Luftwaffe noticed the change, even if it could not immediately explain it. Thunderbolts were no longer vanishing into the ground at the bottom of dives. They were surviving, reappearing, and killing experienced pilots who had done everything correctly, according to the old rules. The air war had shifted, not because of a new aircraft or a new engine, but because one terrified 19-year-old had refused to hide his mistake. What had begun as a desperate escape was now an offensive advantage, and the cost of misunderstanding it was fatal. By mid-1944, the maneuver no longer belonged to a single squadron. It traveled the way real combat knowledge always does, without paperwork and without permission. Pilots spoke about it in quiet tones in barracks rooms, over cheap drinks on leave in London, and during hurried conversations between missions. Men transferred between fighter groups carried the knowledge with them, not as theory, but as something that had already kept them alive. The phrase "drop the gear" began to surface in after-action reports, sometimes written plainly, sometimes disguised in cautious language. It was not yet doctrine, but it was no longer rumor. Official manuals lagged behind reality. The Army Air Forces required reviews, committees, and approvals that moved at a peacetime pace. Even as pilots died at wartime speed, compressibility was still being studied by engineers and aerodynamicists far from the front, reduced to equations and wind tunnel data. But the men flying combat missions did not have the luxury of waiting for certainty. They trusted results. Within weeks, the number of fatal dive recoveries in the 56th Fighter Group dropped sharply. Aircraft came back battered, landing gear strained, airframes stressed, but pilots came back alive. Colonel Zemke made the limits clear. This was not a trick to be exploited. It was not to be used to tighten turns, slow strafing runs, or show off bravado. It was a last-chance maneuver, a way out of a physics trap. Abuse it, and the airplane would punish you. Respect it, and it might save your life. Pilots understood the difference immediately. War had taught them that survival depended not on cleverness, but on discipline. As the maneuver spread, something else became clear. Compressibility, once treated as an unpredictable killer, could be managed. Drag, when introduced deliberately and at the right moment, could overpower shock waves and restore control. This was not luck. It was physics, discovered not in a laboratory, but in a moment of terror, thousands of feet above enemy territory. Engineers would later formalize the concept as drag on demand, but its first proof had come from a shaking hand pulling the wrong lever. Across the channel, German pilots struggled to adapt. Reports described American fighters that refused to die in the dive, aircraft that slowed abruptly and re-engaged instead of vanishing into the ground. The assumptions that had governed air combat were eroding. The dive was no longer a guarantee of escape. Tactics built on that certainty collapsed, and hesitation replaced confidence. In aerial combat, that hesitation was often fatal. By the time the war in Europe ended, the maneuver was no longer secret, but its origin remained largely uncelebrated. There were no headlines about landing gear levers or airflow disruption. The world focused on generals, armies, and the scale of destruction. Robert Booth returned home quietly. He took off his uniform, folded it carefully, and put it away. He went back to civilian life, married his high school sweetheart, and found work repairing farm equipment. The man who had altered the outcome of countless aerial engagements spent his days elbow deep in grease, fixing engines that refused to start. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, it was about the cold, the food, and the friends who never came home. He did not tell his co-workers that his mistake had saved hundreds of pilots. He did not correct the history books that omitted his name. To those around him, he was simply a quiet, capable mechanic who understood machines and treated them with respect. High above him, however, the legacy endured. Engineers designing the next generation of aircraft took the lesson to heart. Speed brakes appeared on jet fighters, not as improvisation, but as standard equipment. The F-86 Sabre used them over Korea. The F-4 Phantom relied on them in Vietnam. Every time a pilot deployed air brakes to control speed in a dive, they were applying the same principle Booth had discovered under panic and pressure. The technique became doctrine, and doctrine rarely remembers who wrote it in blood. For decades, the story remained buried in footnotes and forgotten reports. Robert Booth did not seek recognition, and the system he had helped shape did not offer it. Doctrine absorbed his discovery, stripped it of its origin, and moved on. In engineering textbooks, compressibility was explained with equations and diagrams, but the human moment that had cracked the problem open, was absent. Progress, once formalized, has a habit of erasing the fear, doubt, and chance that made it possible in the first place. It was not until the late 1980s that the thread resurfaced. Aviation historian Dr. James H. Hall, researching the combat record of the P-47 Thunderbolt, noticed a pattern in declassified mission reports from the 56th Fighter Group. Again and again, pilots referenced emergency dive recoveries involving gear extension. The language was careful, understated, but consistent. Casualties from compressibility. Dives dropped sharply after April 1944. Hall followed the trail backward through memos and maintenance logs until he reached a single name written in the margins of a test report. Second Lieutenant R. Booth. Hall tracked Booth down to a quiet house with a porch swing and a garden out back. When asked about the maneuver, Booth seemed genuinely puzzled. He described it not as a breakthrough, but as the time he had grabbed the wrong handle. Hall explained what that moment had become, how it had shaped aircraft design, and saved lives long after the war ended. Booth listened, smiled softly, and shrugged. He had not done it for textbooks or legacy. He had done it because he did not want to die, and because once he realized it worked, he could not justify keeping it to himself. That choice mattered more than the mistake itself. Booth could have hidden what happened, protected his pride, avoided scrutiny, and walked away with a secret that saved only one life, his own. Instead, he spoke up. He accepted doubt, risk, and the possibility of being wrong. Because of that, the knowledge spread. Because the knowledge spread, pilots lived. That is the difference between luck and professionalism. Robert Booth passed away in 1991. He never wrote a memoir. He never went on speaking tours or charged for interviews. Yet every time a jet fighter deploys its air brakes, every time a commercial airliner slows on descent, the physics at work trace back to that panicked pull of a lever in 1944. His legacy is not a monument or a medal, but a principle embedded so deeply in flight that it feels inevitable. The story of Robert Booth is more than a war story. It is a reminder that innovation is rarely clean or deliberate. It is born from pressure, from fear, from moments when theory collapses and instinct takes over. Progress does not always come from brilliance planned in advance, but from mistakes recognized and shared. The world is shaped not only by generals and engineers, but by mechanics, rookies, farm boys, and accidental heroes who refuse to let a hard lesson die with them. History often remembers victories. It should also remember the quiet decisions that made survival possible.